Okay, so we are talking about, last week we actually talked about choosing a madhab, didn't we? It was, the talk is kind of about choosing a madhab and choosing a scholar, but it happened by chance to divide neatly across the line between choosing a madhab and choosing a scholar. Okay, so we've actually done the bit about choosing a madhab. And just as a quick recap, and I'm conscious that we have a lot to cover today, so let's not make our recap too lengthy. Let's make this a little bit larger. So we looked at the question of, well, why do you need scholars in the first place, right? In the olden days, you couldn't avoid scholars because universities were, the teachers in universities were scholars. They were run by scholars. Judges, the law was upheld by scholars. The law of the land was upheld by scholars, qadis. Okay, so these were official scholars that were making judgments. And, Sharia, in a very literal sense, was the law of the land in many Muslim countries. And so, our context now in Britain is totally different, where we have our own British law, which of course is based on many of the principles, the maqasid of the Sharia, but not the exact laws of the Sharia. So Muslim scholars are kind of, you might say, left disenfranchised and left without purpose, but they're not. So scholars still have a role, and we saw this diagram here about the kind of, what you might understand as Islam, and you've got all the kind of laws of state, etc., and the functions of state where scholars were involved. But then you have the need for scholars with regards to our personal Sharia, our laws on a day-to-day basis, our religious practices, and sometimes we're not sure, so we go to scholars for advice. Okay, but then also when it comes to Iman, when it comes to strengthening that faith, you know what your belief is, but to toughen that security in that belief. And also to get that real love for the religion and the love for God, to get the level of ihsan where the Prophet ﷺ, as he explained, to worship Allah as if you're seeing him. The help to get that way comes from people who are close to the way of the Prophet and close to his teachings, people who are close to the Quran, who know it off by heart, know the commentaries, etc. And these are scholars. Okay, so scholars, of course, have a great role still in our lives, and we need to, respect them and turn to them wherever possible and stay close to them, actually. All right. But then in the context of rulings, so this is where, obviously, we're not talking about rulings of government, but we're talking about rulings that affect us personally. So whether it's worship or whether something's halal or haram, we're not sure, that kind of thing. Then these rulings, we turn to scholars of rulings. Okay, and I'll talk about a bit more about who they are. And that area is mainly what we've been focusing on in the last talk and also in this talk. So when it comes to rulings, there is one approach, which is a traditional approach, and many of our parents will have taken this approach, and to a large extent we do ourselves, which is that basically you say, okay, what are the rules on prayer? Don't give me the whys and wherefores, all right? That may go into volumes and volumes. I need to learn how to pray, and I need to learn how to pray yesterday. So keep it simple and sweet. Just tell me what the rules are. What do I have to do? Where can I do it? And it's nice, but it's not absolutely necessary. So if I'm in a hurry or something, or if I forget, it doesn't matter. So what you call the fara'id of the prayer, the essentials of prayer, what are the extras, the sunnahs? Just tell it to me. I don't care if there's a difference of opinion. Some other people do it in different ways. Just make it simple. Let me follow it, please. Okay, and that's fine. So this is what some people call, slightly rudely, I would say, blind following, but I would call it simple following. Okay, you're not making it complicated. You just want to follow a scholar who's worked it all out for you, nice and simple. And so the madhabs will have different ways of praying. You say, okay, well, my parents were Hanafi, I'll be Hanafi. If they're Shafi, that's fine, I'll be Shafi. I don't want to pray in a different way to my parents. I don't want to go to the mosque and look weird and everyone's turning around and then patting my shoulder afterwards and saying, what did you do there, sort of thing. Okay, I'll just pray the way everybody else prays. What's the big deal? And the thing is that there's a unanimity amongst the scholars that approach is fine. Okay, don't worry, it's okay. And Shah Waliullah, we've got this quote of Shah Waliullah here explaining that there's a unanimity here. So if anyone tells you that that's not the case, their opinion is minority, okay? The majority of scholars have held that it's fine to do that, okay? And actually scholars themselves, most of the time, don't choose their madhab. It's chosen for them. They have a love for the religion, okay? They have a love for Allah. They want to learn more about the religion. They go to an institution. The institution teaches them one madhab, they follow it. Simple, okay? And the madhab of the institution is dependent on the country that they're in. And we saw that actually the madhabs ended up where they did just by flukes, by actual historical flukes. So we have, Shafi'i madhab being centered around Egypt, Yemen, the Horn of Africa, South India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, etc. Okay, because it was carried along by traders. They followed the Shafi'i madhab. They didn't ask too many questions. Wherever they landed, people said, okay, what's Islam? How do we practice it? They said, well, this is Islam. Okay, their Islam was a Shafi'i Islam. It's fine. Okay, and so what's the big deal? Yeah, that's how it was. Okay, so we've understood that. We've also understood that, okay, if you personally want to change your madhab and you particularly like the style and the approach of another madhab, then that's fine as well. Okay, and that there was a difference in the style originally, way back. Okay, that the madhab's imams had their own style, their own kind of flavor, interpretation of what they thought the sunnah was, because we follow the Quran and the sunnah, but how do you define sunnah? And there was a difference where some scholars said the sunnah is just the hadith, and the imams, just follow the hadith. Some imams said, oh, it's the hadith, weak or strong. It's just any hadith. If it's there, I'm going to follow that. Others said, no, it's the analysis. Give me lots of hadith. Let me get to principles. Let me analyze it. Set up a kind of a stack of consistent, coherent principles. And these principles, based on hadith, based on Quran, can then be applied widely in all sorts of new contexts. And that was the approach of Imam Abu Hanifa, who was himself faced by challenging contexts, right? He was in a country that was new to Islam, and people coming from all sorts of different backgrounds and different philosophies. And he actually explained that to Imam Malik, who felt it was better to just stick to hadith and the traditions of the people of Medina. Anyway, we've done this, and we've done this many times before as well. So let's move on. And the notes are there. I still have to send you the old notes, but inshallah we'll do so very, very shortly. I really will. Okay, the approach of the Imams also then was slightly different when it came to new problems as well. We've talked about that, but I won't go into that again. So what was really interesting, though, was that actually as time evolved, and this is a sunnah of humanity, actually, right? This is the way that humans generally behave, is that they do learn. They like to learn from other ways of practicing, other, ideas. They like to take them on. But what they often don't do is jettison their heritage, and they will stick to their identity, but take on new ideas. And that's what the Imams in many madhabs did over the centuries, that they took ideas that were from other madhabs and approaches that were from other madhabs, but they didn't lose their heritage of their madhab. And you can see the reason for that. So you see that in religions even, where people will, adapt their religion in many ways to new contexts, but they will still keep their religion. And because through that, you have your grounding in your community, you have your recognition in a community as well. So for a scholar, I mean, obviously a religion is different, where when you really feel the pull of a new religion, of course, you should go to it. Of course, come to Islam, of course. But with madhabs, they will often keep their identity of their madhab, and very few scholars in the past have actually broken from their madhab, actually. And and often they were amazing people, because it takes a huge amount of courage and pluck, you might say, to do that, right? And because what happens is when you do that, you're disenfranchised somewhat. Okay. Oh, have I lost my camera? Just bear with me. Yeah. So there's a there's a disconnect then with your community. So often wouldn't do that. So we went through 3 very good examples of where scholars did that. Okay, where, for instance, scholars of the Shafi'i madhab, and the Shafis are kind of famous originally for being very strict in maintaining their attachment to strictly the Sunnah, without asking questions, without you doing too much analysis and too much thinking. And yet, the Shafi scholars like Imam Ghazali looked into the purpose, did some analysis and thinking about the purpose of the religion, and established the science of maqasid, which is amazing, right? Then another scholar really developed it, Imam al-Shatibi, who was a Maliki. And again, Maliki originally used to call themselves Ahl al-Hadith, the people who like to stick strictly to the Hadith, although they didn't exactly do that, but that's how they kind of identified themselves. So you can see that actually the scholars from all the madhabs learned from each other and actually adapted their principles. And so now, when you look at a scholar from any madhab, they will be trained actually in many of the same principles which have been taken from scholars of all the different backgrounds. So many of Imam Shafi's teachings on how to reconcile hadith were fantastic, and they've been taken over by many of the Imams of the other madhabs. Okay, so for instance, here we have this great quote by Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, was one of our great British Imams, and he talks about, he explains that, look, when you're looking at a scholar, and we're talking about a mufti here, this is a scholar who issues fatwas, a scholar of rulings, they have to have an extensive training in the skills that will allow them to issue rulings. Okay, and the point he's making there is that a scholar of rulings, and the process of rulings is called ifta. So a scholar of rulings is called a mufti. Okay, so a mufti has to have a very extensive and broad training. So you can start off as a imam, you might say, or as a scholar with a very general sort of training in learning the Quran. Very often they'll learn the Quran off by heart. They will study maybe a book of hadith or two, like Bukhari, etc. They will study all the rulings of a particular madhab. Now, that doesn't make them an expert in issuing new rulings. It just means that they can tell you, well, if somebody asks you, Imam Saab, how do we pray the Hanafi way? Where do we put our hands? He'll be able to tell you that. That's what the basic scholar teaching is, right? Then, if you want to become a mufti, your training has to then kind of expand and transcend the basic stuff. Okay, then you have to understand the Arabic language in great detail. So when you're looking at a verse of the Quran, you're then trying to understand, okay, exactly what the implications of that verse, if it's related to a ruling, are. Okay, or a hadith for that matter. You have to have a deep understanding of how you assess the authenticity of hadith. It doesn't mean you need to be an expert of hadith, okay, because that's a science in itself. So there's experts of hadith are called muhaddithun, and they are essentially like Islamic historians par excellence. So after Ramadan, we will talk about this, but they are amazing, amazing historians. Their knowledge of the way that a hadith is authenticated, so it's a bit of historical evidence, is substantiated. How do you prove that the Prophet said or did X, Y, or Z? And they have a very elaborate system of evidence forming, right, substantiate the hadith. But a mufti must understand and have a good knowledge of hadith and also the science of hadith. But on top of that, also the process of interpreting hadith. We talked about this last time, usul al-hadith, that, you know, it's mandatory to follow the sunnah where a hadith complies with usul al-hadith. So the usul al-hadith are the principles through which you analyze hadith and work out which hadith, because not all hadith do, but which hadith are to be followed, make up the legal sunnah, the type of sunnah that you have to follow, okay? And not all hadith do that, and that's crucial. So mufti has the analytical skills and training to be able to make sense of those hadith, right? And we looked at how they do that. We looked at examples of that in previous circles. Okay, and then they have to have a deep understanding, knowledge, should I say, of the heritage. You know, what, you know, if they've got an interpretation, how valid is that interpretation? As in, like, how many other people have seen it that way? Are there other scholars that agree with that? You know, what did other scholars say, and what was their arguments for it? Putting it all together, what's your judgment going to be? Do you see? So, you know, rather than making a ruling that really sticks out, there should be some kind of justification, some kind of historical precedent for your opinion, right? So you have to have a knowledge of that. Then you have to have a knowledge of the tools of how you take an evidence from the past and apply it into a completely new situation. That in itself is a phenomenal skill, okay? So you need that knowledge as well. And then you have to understand, you have to have a good understanding of the society and understand what the public interests are in that society. What are the needs? What are the problems of the community that you're ruling for? Okay, and what are the threats of that community? What are the implications going to be of your ruling? So we looked at the example of, for instance, Ibn Taymiyyah last time, and how even though he's a Hanbali scholar who are very strict in just following the Sunnah, you would think, but he actually said it's crucial for scholars to analyze the implications of their rulings and to make sure that they're conferring benefit. And the emphasis of benefit was a Maliki principle, maslaha, right? But the Hanbali scholar is talking about its importance. So now all jurists should have an awareness of that, whatever madhab they come from. Okay, this concept of the masalih. And then they should have an understanding of the maqasid. So the maqasid is the underlying purposes of the Sharia, that when you put all the rules together, what is the religion actually trying to achieve? So when you make a ruling, is it consistent with the overall intentions of the lawgiver, as they say, as the jurists often say, the intentions of the lawgiver, that what we understand from all the teachings, what Allah wants mankind to do. So by following this ruling, is it consistent with what Allah would want mankind to do? Do you see? Is it in accordance essentially with the overall sunnah of the Prophet, you might say, right? So that kind of awareness also is crucial. So you can see how, on top of that, of course, a phenomenal piety, so that they're actually doing things for the right reason, making their judgments for the right reason, and intellect. You have to have that basic core, deep intellect to be able to get to the root of matters and understand what the root of the Islamic teaching is, based on all the evidences out there, the plethora of evidences, some which seem to conflict, right? Put it all together, come together with what the idea of Islamic teachings are, and then look at, well, what are the problems, and really get to the heart of what the problem is that the person's coming to you with, and make sure that the ruling fits the problem like a glove, okay, and it solves the problem and it causes greater benefit. That's the rule, that's the approach of a jurist. So yeah, if you're going to someone for an opinion, especially an opinion where it's going to have an impact on maybe, you know, your practical life, like your job, or, you know, whether you even go out or not, etc., then you should go to a jurist who has those qualifications, okay? I'm not telling you who they are. You're gonna have to find them, or you can ask me personally who I might recommend. Okay, so let's take the example of hadith. We've done this. Circle before last, we went through this, and the circles before that as well. That, you know, it takes a person of immense learning to understand this, that when you actually look at hadith, you can't take a hadith and just follow it and say, oh, that's the ruling. Simple. It's not that simple. Actually, sometimes a hadith may appear to contradict the Quran, right? So we had the example, for instance, of a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said that my father and your father are in hellfire. And some people might assume from that that anyone that came before Islam was in the hellfire. But actually, there are Quranic ayat which explain that we do not punish until we send a messenger. So you actually, people are almost kind of free of guilt to some extent, or free of judgment against their following Islam until a messenger comes to them clearly, right? So that was one, that's an important principle. And I think even now Muslims are not clear on that point. Then there are things that conflict the Sunnah. We looked at hadith, which seemed quite perplexing, where the Prophet ﷺ was telling the companions to push non-Muslims to the narrowest path and be quite harsh with them. And you think, what? How can that be part of the Sunnah? You know, that's not the way that's not good. We're not supposed to behave like that. But we saw that there's a context to that, right? We went through that. We saw how sometimes you can look at one hadith and not understand it unless you look at other hadith. And if you just follow one hadith, you get a ruling that actually causes hardship, which wasn't intended maybe. And it had a context. We looked at two examples. We looked at an example of where the Prophet forbade women from visiting graves. And then later, if you actually look, there are hadith where Aisha herself asks, when I go to the grave, what do I say? Right? End of. Okay. So it takes scholars to understand that, oh, but there's other hadith. Have you considered those other hadith, which are also authentic, by the way? Okay. In terms of mahram for traveling, women, you know, still now, women will only go so far, won't go any further because it's against their religion, they think, right? But then we saw how there is a hadith where, authentic, where the Prophet was intending to create a society where a woman could travel alone, right? So this is about analysis. It's about seeing hadith, seeing the evidence and the arguments behind the hadith, or the intentions behind the hadith, and putting them together for a judgment. So you'll see scholars who veer towards one opinion and another, more analytical versus just taking one hadith and following it. Okay, in Medina at the moment, you can't go to Jannat al-Baqi if you're a woman, right? So that's the opinion that the scholars there are imposing on people from all across the world, I'm afraid, you know. Then we've seen that sometimes the language that the Prophet uses appears ambiguous. It's not very clear. Like the hadith we looked at where he said, differ from the disbelievers. And we said, well, actually, you know, some scholars have seen that as meaning you've got to differ in your customs, your clothes, okay? And then we looked at, oh, but hang on, what if they're nice customs? Do we have to do, what if they're lining up? Do we not line up? What if they're strict, punctual with their time? Do we have to deliberately arrive 10 minutes late, 15 minutes late? Do you see the point? So anyway, and then the crucial thing of capacities of the Prophet, which is massive. And this is something that, you know, the jurists understand. And maybe, you know, certainly I hadn't until I read about it, come across it. You don't see it being mentioned much. Most Muslims will not know about the capacities of the Prophet. That in actual fact, many times when the Prophet did or said something, it was in the capacity of him just being a human being or being an Arab, etc. So when it comes to clothing, for instance, he wore the clothes of his people, right? And the Arabs, being trading people, wore clothes from all over the world. They wore nice Persian clothes with a bit of silk trimming. They wore Yemeni clothes. They wore Roman clothes, Byzantine clothes, and the Prophet did, and he liked them. His favorite clothes were Persian clothes sometimes, right? And then sometimes he wore trousers, sometimes he wore thobes. So, you know, some people who talk about, or lungis, which are like sarongs. So often he wore sarongs. And, you know, when you talk about the garment trailing, that's actually the sarong trailing, like the robes trailing, and people lift up their trousers, but actually it wasn't about rolling up your trousers, it's about sarong. And there's a context to that as well. But that, you know, so Sheikh Omar Farouk Abdullah basically has summarized this. He says that, look, the supreme sunnah of the Prophet is that he dressed like his people, right? That's the supreme sunnah. So you could look at specific hadith and take the specific sunnah of, oh, he wore this clothes, he wore Yemeni clothes. Do we have to wear Yemeni clothes? He liked to wear Persian clothes. Is that what we have to wear? Do you see? No, but it's just the wore the clothes of people, and his likes were on the basis of what his people generally liked, right? So similarly, you know, we had certain likes and dislikes with food, and that was just his personal likes. He told his companions, eat the meat. And they sat down and they're about to eat, and his wife told him, oh, it's lizard, by the way. So he didn't eat it, but he told them to eat. Now, should the companions say, oh, but the sunnah is not to eat lizard, because the Prophet didn't like to eat lizard. So we saw the amazing quotes by this professor of Islamic law, Hisham Kamali, and that book, Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence, is one to read if you have, inclination in that regard. And he talked about this whole concept of capacities, and he talked about how the Prophet ﷺ sometimes would do things in the capacity of just being an Arab. He would say things that weren't related to the religion, and they don't need to be followed. And so anything to do with technology or science or medicine, this is not what he came as a prophet to do. Right. So, for instance, if you were to ask, now there's lots of videos going around at the moment about, say, black seed. Okay, and I've seen something being passed around on WhatsApp. I had to respond to it, saying, "Oh yeah, if you get breathless, inhale black seed vapor." Right. So, first of all, where did the Prophet say inhale black seed vapor? Okay, and if you ever went to a jurist, they would never say to you, if you're getting breathless, inhale black seed vapor. They would say, consult a doctor first, because the Prophet did not come as a physician, right? Simple, okay? He basically advised on the basis of the medicine that was around at the time. And if he said that there's a shifa for everything in black seed except death, that's a single hadith that's in Bukhari, okay? Can you use that as law? Should you use that as like, oh, this is something that you religiously have to do, it's mustahab? And the scholars of usul and the jurists will say, no, that's not the case. That's his opinion based on his context. Okay, if he was around today, he would say, if you're breathless and you've got COVID-19, seek a doctor's advice and consider a ventilator, right? He wouldn't say inhale black seed oil. Okay, and I'm sure of that. I'm absolutely sure, because you can ask any scholar that knows about how to make Islamic rulings, and they will explain that point. Okay, so yeah, this is the importance of following a scholar. So you don't, if you've got a scholar who's, for instance, a mufassir, that's a scholar of tafsir, all right, they know the Quran very well. You turn to them for understanding the Quran, getting inspiration about the Quran. Okay, you don't turn to them for rulings. Right? People come to me for rulings sometimes. Heck, I'm a GP. Why are you coming to me for Islamic rulings? Do you see the point that you have to go to the kind of person who has the right skills? So the mufti is the kind of person you need to go to, the person who's been trained in the process of jurisprudence. And very often, you'll see the people using the analogy of doctors, for instance. So mufti, because what they're doing is they're understanding, they've got their basic knowledge, and then they have to be able to drill down to this precise context and ask exactly the right questions to find out what is the exact problem that you're asking about, right? Then I can get you a solution, right? It won't be, so you wouldn't, it's not like a Google search, I've got a headache, what does Google say? Google says, oh, take paracetamol, or Google says, oh, it's a brain tumor, make sure you get referred for an MRI scan, right? So you go to a physician and he will ask you 15 questions, right? When did it start? What's the character of it? Whereabouts on the head do you get the pain? What makes it better? What makes it worse? What time of day do you get it? What's the nature of the pain? Is it sharp? Is it throbbing? Is it jabbing? Is it a pressure? Is it a tightness? Etc., etc. And after putting all of that together, they get a conclusion of what this is, and then what might be your solution. Do you see? And this is exactly the same with the jurist. That's the kind of person that you go to for scholarly advice. So the interesting thing about a jurist is that they understand the underlying purpose of the religion being to confer benefit, right? Fundamentally. So, you know, we know that the Quran says that وَلَا يُرِيدُكُمُ الْعُسْرَ, that Allah doesn't want hardship for you. That's not the purpose. So when you see, for instance, that even in the Quran itself, when it talks about fasting, it talks about the exceptions to make it very clear that hardship is not the idea. Spiritual purification, but don't do harm. Yeah, that's the point. And so we, you know, the underlying principle is that the religion is a mercy. Yeah, that the Prophet was sent. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. You have not been sent. We have not sent you except as a mercy to all of the worlds. You bring mercy, you bring benefit, you bring positivity, happiness, you lighten the burdens. This is one of the descriptions of the Prophet, that he frees people from the yokes that were upon them, right? So Islam's like a liberation. It's not meant to make life more difficult. So a good jurist is liberal with rukhsas. Rukhsas are exceptions, they're concessions, right? So the law is this, but I'm giving you a concession because I understand your problem and your context, and I know that the lawgiver intends ease. Do you get it? All right. So, you know, ask the scholar, what's the rukhsa for me here? All right, you should be expecting a rukhsa. If he's not using rukhsas very much, then, you know, then wonder, for instance, right? So, you know, the idea then is that the skill of a jurist is that they're able to answer the question that, Sheikh, if the Prophet was here today, what would he tell me to do? This is my exact situation, right? I've got this problem and this is how it goes, right? I've got this job, and in this job I have to do this and that and that. And I've got this boss and da 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 da. You know, what would the Prophet advise me to do in this situation? Do you see? And we know that the Prophet ﷺ would give different rulings to different people. Yeah, and that shows that as a judge, as a jurist, the Prophet ﷺ had that flexibility, and that's what's expected of jurists today as well. So we have the quote here of Ibn al-Qayyim, who's a great Imam of the Hanbali madhab, a student of Imam Taymiyyah, and he explains this point that the rulings have to be tailored and they have to change, they ought to change, right? So he says that legal interpretation should change with the change in time, place, conditions, intentions, and customs. And ignorance of this fact has resulted in grievous injustice to the Sharia. So people are doing things in the name of Sharia, which is actually damaging the Sharia, and it's harming people. It's giving Sharia a bad name. Yeah. So although it's known that the noble Sharia serves the highest interests of mankind, and it wouldn't sanction such results. Do you see? So you have scholars who will open a book that's centuries old, and it was written with rulings for very specific things, rulings made not only centuries ago, but in a completely different context. In, let's say, 18th century India. Honestly, there are scholars now who are studying the specific rulings of 18th century India, and they will open the book up and read it to you. But that's a different world. You know, last time, the time before, I talked about a book which thankfully is out of print, thankfully, which is called Answers to Some Common Questions Asked by New Muslims. Right, now this was a compilation of questions that were asked of Saudi scholars who obviously had no real understanding of what life in the Western world is like. These opinions were then compiled together into a book and published and distributed in bookshops in Britain at the time. Okay, thankfully out of print. So in this book, I showed you one fatwa of a scholar. It was a very respected scholar of Saudi Arabia, but he said that he used that hadith. Remember that hadith we talked about where the Prophet said that don't initiate greetings with non-Muslims, and if they greet you, then say "and upon you," and push them into the narrowest part of the path. Okay, so he said, don't initiate when you meet someone. The question was something like, when you meet someone, what do you say? He said, don't initiate the greeting. Only if they greet you, then say, and upon you. Right? Specifically, those wa alaykum. You have to use those words. Now, okay, I'm a GP. I'm making phone calls. Nowadays, we're just making phone calls. Am I supposed to really ring somebody, right, who's waiting for my phone call, ring and not say anything? So the person picks the phone up and there's a queer, deadly silence. And the person that goes, hello? And all they can hear is like my breathing or something. Can you imagine? I mean, it's not the context. I mean, these are inappropriate rulings. That book is full of these. As I said, thankfully it's out of print. But there are rulings, for instance, that says that, you have to hate non-Muslims, but you can be nice to them if you think that being nice to them will bring them to Islam. There are rulings that if a woman asks you about Islam, ask her to cover herself and cover her face. But if she refuses to, then you can carry on talking. There is a ruling that somebody is thinking of becoming a Muslim. You have to tell them first that if they change their mind, they'll be executed. I mean, honestly, these rulings are completely absurd. And, how could you possibly expect this to be passed around to Muslims in this country? And, you can still find this book online in an Islam hating site, right? Because they're loving it. They're loving it, not surprisingly. So the great Imams of the past were scathing towards this practice. Imam al-Qarafi, who's an 18th century Maliki jurist, he says that persons handing down legal judgments while adhering blindly to the texts in their books, without regard for the cultural realities of their people, are in gross error. They act in contradiction to the established legal consensus and are guilty of iniquity and disobedience before God, having no excuse despite their ignorance. Right, so literally he's saying that this is a phenomenal sin for the scholars, for they have taken upon themselves the art of issuing legal rulings. And we've seen that it's an art, right? And they've taken that on without actually being worthy of that practice. They haven't gotten the skills. Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he says that many of our scholars live in their books and do not live in their reality. They've got no understanding of their surrounding reality because they have not read the book of life. Yeah, but they only read the books of their predecessors, and they just open them up and read them out. Yeah, for that reason, their fatwas appear as if they've just come out of the grave, literally. Oh, subhanallah. So I hope you've got some understanding there of how, beware if somebody starts just quoting some scholar from a different world, a different century, a different universe. Okay. They have to be people who understand our context. Now, big question. Is it obligatory to stick to one madhab? In essence, look, you will hear a lot about how important it is to stick to one madhab. But again, this is something that's kind of out of context. The context where it was important to be consistent with a madhab was when there was a madhab of the country, when the judges had a consistent rule book. Right, and you couldn't take rules from one country, essentially, which is like one madhab, and then there's another madhab in another country. So you can't take the madhab, the ruling for one thing from one country and another from another, and expect them to work together. Okay, you have to have a consistent rule book. Otherwise, one person is being treated differently to another person because you're using lenient rules with one person and harsh rules with another. No, you can't do that. You've got to be consistent in your judgments, right? And it's in that context that it was crucial that you stuck to a madhab. But is that really the case now? Well, actually, if you look at there's an extensive amount of text here, which is taken from an extract of a book by Shah Waliullah Dahlawi, who I spoke about last time. Phenomenal scholar. When you read his stuff, he just feels like he's like a regular person, even though he wrote like 300 years ago. But he's got such a penetrating insight, and he just explains this fact that that people just ask different people different questions, even at the time of the Prophet. But the other thing that was important is that at the time of the Prophet, companions were averse to asking too many questions. You know how people really delve into the details and they're like, oh, but how this, and oh, but how this. Well, this is condemned in Surah Baqarah, was it not? That Bani Israel were doing this. Oh, you want us to sacrifice a cow? What kind of cow? And it got harsher and harsher. So remember once when somebody asked, Ya Rasulullah, do we have to do Hajj every year? And the Prophet got angry and said, if I'd said yes, would you be able to do it every year? Yeah, and it was the excessive questioning of people before you that led to their destruction, he said. In so many words. So the approach of the companions was that they didn't ask too many questions. They weren't there to get nitty-gritties of rules. That wasn't their purpose. They understood that the religion was there to change people and was about making them into good people who were generous, people who shone a light, people who exemplified the love of God. That's what it was about. It wasn't about people who have a very harsh and rigid way of understanding and practicing their religion. Okay, so for instance, we've got a person who said that certainly the companions of the Messenger of Allah sallam, that I met were more than I missed. So this is a tabi'un saying, right? So in other words, he saw more than he didn't see. I don't know if that's an exaggeration, but nonetheless, companions. Yeah. The they'd quite easily just go and ask someone.
Rizwan, I think there's something wrong with your microphone.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Wait a minute. Let me just see. Maybe the mic has changed. Can anybody hear me now at the moment?
We can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Great. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Let's find my window. Where is it? Okay. Yep. So that was the way of the early time. We're kind of stuck in this idea that, oh, you have madhabs, you have to choose a madhab. Remember, there was a time before madhabs, and people were actually very free and relaxed in the way that they followed rulings then. So actually, you can. So there's no reason why you can't actually. Some people say that, oh, if you pick and choose, will you end up finding the easiest rulings all the time? And is that not the same as following your whims? And I'm sure you'll have heard that. And that's, you could say that's worrying. But actually, remember that the religion itself is meant to be easy. It's not meant to be extreme, So the Prophet, for instance, he said that beware of excessiveness in religion, those before you perished as a result of success, of such excessiveness in their religion. So this idea of going for the harshest opinion, that's actually not what the religion was about. And the Quran says, كَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا, that we have made you a middle way, right? That doesn't go towards extremes. It's not completely lax, but it's not completely extreme either, right? It doesn't go to excesses. So this ayah in Surah Ma'idah, that, oh, you who believe, make not unlawful the good things which Allah has made lawful for you. So people somehow find that, oh, the pious thing to do is to find an excuse for not doing something, for being forbidden something, right? But actually what you're doing then is you're taking on the role, the divine role of prohibiting things, which Allah doesn't want you to do if it's actually halal. So actually in Islam, there's a principle of taysir, which is making things easy. And that's what scholars are supposed to do as well. And that's the kind of scholar you want to look for, actually, who understands your predicament and is there to make things easy for you. So taysir basically is the approach of facilitation. And that's the way of the Prophet. So this is Aisha herself, who knew the Prophet very well. And she says about him that the Prophet ﷺ never chose between two things, one difficult and the other easy, except that he would choose the easier of the two, as long as there's no sin in it. All right? Whereas people think, oh, there's two options, but one's hard, there's got to be more reward in that, because it's hard and it's painful. Okay, but self-flagellation is not part of our religion. The Prophet ﷺ said that verily the religion is easy and no one burdens himself in the religion, but that it overwhelms him. Yeah, make it too hard and it will overwhelm you. That's the warning of the Prophet ﷺ. And there's lots of evidences to that effect as well. So, just bear that in mind. Now, there's a lovely quote at the end of it, which really explains this principle of taysir. So this is Sheikh bin Bayyah, who's like he's the teacher of Imam Hamza Yusuf, who had a very great influence on Imam Hamza Yusuf. He's one of the leading scholars of the world. He sort of heads so many committees that, you could probably not list his achievements really in one page. But he basically explains this point that, look, the ideal thing is to look for the whys and wherefores of opinions, and make sure that you're coming to a ruling that actually confers benefit, okay? But if you're not able to do that, then follow a scholar that does that. And that's essentially what this quote's about. Have a good read of it later. But it's really, that's what your scholars should be teaching you. That's the approach they should be offering. Now, what about if you follow, there are two opinions, and you follow an opinion which seems easier, it's nice, but it ends up being wrong. What happens then? And we've actually seen before as well that the Prophet ﷺ would endorse, when there are different opinions, he'd endorse them. So there are lots of examples before as well where we've talked about the example of Banu Qurayza, where some companions took him literally, others took him as like, well, what he intends to say is this. And he actually endorsed both opinions, right? And here he actually says that if a judge passes a judgment, having striven to come to the best decision, okay, and gets it right, he gets 2 rewards. But if he passes the judgment and gets it wrong, he still gets 1 reward. So the point is that if you follow that judgment, you're still getting 2 rewards if it's right and 1 if it's wrong, okay? Either way, you're rewarded. That's important. That's the important thing. And this is, subhanAllah, that's the sunnah of the Prophet, that he wasn't insistent on there is one way and this is the right way. He wasn't like that. Yeah, so we see many instances, and the examples are here in the notes. I won't go through them. But like sometimes, a companion did something, and it seems like it was the companion thinking of, well, this is the best, basically a companion needed to do ghusl, and he basically did tayammum instead. The Prophet basically just basically laughed and said, okay, that was the approach of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Now the thing is, fundamentally, is there an issue here that can there be different opinions and they're still right, right? And what I really want to get across is that actually, in many ways, there are different Islams, right? That there is at the core, Islam is the same, but there are different, around the edges, Islam is shaped differently by different scholars and in different contexts, right? So Musa alayhi salam was a Muslim. He practiced Islam, but his Islam was different to the Islam of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And his Islam might be different to our Islam today, because part of his Islam was tailored to his context, and it was tailored to 7th century Arabia. Do you see? And even, you know, Indian Islam and Saudi Islam and Malaysian Islam are all Islam in its different flavors and colors, but they're slightly subtly different. People feel uneasy about that. They always, you know, so sometimes you hear people say, oh, but there is only one Islam, right? Yeah, they say that. But by understanding that there are slightly different flavors of Islam, different manifestations, it allows us that tolerance that, okay, you know, we don't like, let's say, medieval Islam, okay, and we might think, oh, some parts of it, some things actually that were practiced and are pretty bizarre and they feel uncomfortable for us, like slavery, etc., you know, and kind of, you know, treating women differently, treating non-Muslims differently, etc. But it was normal for their context. It was actually what everyone did in that context. Okay, but today we wouldn't endorse it, and that's not the way that we look at Islam today, right? But we don't have to follow an Islam of back then. Do you see? And that's the important lesson that I'm trying to get across here today, is that's valid, that's allowed, yeah? But remember that in the core, the Islam stays the same, and that core stays the same across different prophets as well. Okay, it's around the peripheries that you get different manifestations and shades, different colors, different flavors, right? So if, for instance, if we look at marriage, you know, there are so many things about marriage that all the different madhabs will agree on, that Shias and Sunnis will agree on, okay? But it will be different with different religions. Other religions will have a different approach to these things, okay? I won't go through them, but you can have a look at them and you can actually list them yourself. So it makes you realize that, oh, actually, at the core, there's an agreement on what Islam is, but around the peripheries, there are differences, right? So exactly how do you define a divorce, etc., might be different in different madhabs, but that you can have a divorce is agreed, right? In Christianity, Catholicism, you weren't allowed to have a divorce originally. Yeah. So differences of opinion. This is the final point to make, is that, remember, there is an immense tolerance of differences of opinion. Okay, I just want to give you this one quote of Sufyan al-Thawri, one of the great scholars of the past. He says that if you see a man doing something over which there is a debate among the scholars and which you yourself have been believed to be forbidden, you should not forbid him from doing it. He does something and you think that is wrong, that's haram, but you know that there's a difference of opinion on it. Don't forbid him. You're not allowed to forbid him. Do you see the point? And that's about the point of respecting different madhabs as well. Okay, that's the approach. So for instance, At-Tabi'i said that the people of knowledge are a people of broadness, Ahl al-Tawasi'. They continue to give fatwas which are different from each other, and no scholar reproaches another scholar for his opinion. I'm going to give you this one beautiful instance of difference, okay? Ibn Abbas and Zayd bin Thabit, both phenomenal scholars, right? Zayd bin Thabit was the man who was instrumental in bringing together the Quran, and he had a phenomenal knowledge of the Quran, okay? And they were both muftis, you know, so some companions were and some weren't, but these were both very knowledgeable companions of the Quran, of the Sunnah of the Prophet, and they gave rulings. People came to them for them. So they had a difference about inheritance. Inheritance is a complicated matter, okay, and it's not surprising that they have differences. And Ibn Abbas was, you know, really upset with Zayd on his opinion about certain element. And he to the point where he said, doesn't Zayd fear God in equating the grandson with the son? Etc., etc. I mean, it's a technical matter, okay? But then once Ibn Abbas comes across Zayd, and Zayd was riding the camel. So Ibn Abbas takes hold of the reins and leads the camel. And Zayd protested. He said, "Oh, cousin of the Prophet." Ibn Abbas was cousin of the Prophet. He said, "Oh, cousin of the Messenger of Allah, don't do that." And Ibn Abbas said, "This is how we've been instructed to treat the learned ones and our elders." Subhanallah. And then Zayd says, "Can I have your hand?" Ibn Abbas offers his hand and he kisses it. And he says, "And this is how we've been told to behave towards the family of the Prophet." And then when he passed away, because Zayd bin Thabit was more senior than Ibn Abbas, and he passed away before him, Ibn Abbas then remarks that today knowledge in abundance has been buried. Subhanallah. That's the love and respect they had, despite their differences on issues where, he's like really surprised at Zayd's opinion on something. So anyway, this is, we've looked before about Imam Ahmad and his tolerance of difference of opinion, that he didn't like people to follow him blindly, and that, he actually instructed his followers to write. Somebody had written a book that was about kind of like, the core of divergence, how we've diverged from other madhabs. And he said, no, change that. Call it the book of leeway. That are the different opinions. You can follow any of them. Okay, so these are the kind of things I wanted to get across, really. That when we're looking at scholars, let's bear in mind. So in summary, so what I'm saying is that remember that there are different interpretations of Islam, and you could call them different Islams. Okay, and that's fine. And at the core of it, it's the same. Okay, the flavors are different, but it's still cool. It's still creamy. It's still ice cream. Still got a cone. Okay, but it has different colors, different flavors in different countries and contexts, and it should. And that's only right, because Islam actually means something when it actually takes on the flavor of that land. Okay, and it talks in the language of the land. Okay, we'll talk about that a lot more in future circles, inshallah. Okay. And we've seen that actually, it's perfectly legitimate to just follow simply if you want to. That's all right. As long as you're not breaking the law, you're not harming anyone else, you're not forcing anyone else to follow that particular opinion as well. Okay, that's really important. And as long as you're not telling people that this is the only opinion, right? Recognize that there is the difference there. Okay. And you can follow the way of your parents, and that's fine as well. And also the idea that, there is a reason why there's lots of different opinions. And we've gone into why that is. There's so many reasons, often to do with hadith and how you interpret them, how there's different hadith, different companions have different opinions, etc., etc. And all of that is just a rich heritage, actually, for us. All right, it's not a curse. All those differences are part of the heritage that gives scholars the leeway to find an opinion that, to find a precedent for an opinion that suits your context, right? And our context is a minority context. So, famous mufti in our context, he says that in a minority context, you should have minority opinions. Makes sense, right? Why would you follow the majority if the majority rulings were made in a completely different context to ours, right? So when you're seeking rulings, make sure you're asking a jurist. You're not asking a muhaddith. You're not asking an expert of tafsir. It has to be someone who has the skills and qualifications in making rulings, okay? That they are well versed in our context, our Western context. For instance, if they've got Western degrees, they've lived the life of this country, okay? They haven't lived a cloistered life, essentially. They understand harm and benefit, and that they take that into consideration in their judgments. That generally they're making things easy. That's allowed. That's good, okay? And that they're moderate and they're not harsh. That's in summary what we've been talking about. And I hope you will see from the notes that there is actually very sound justification for this being the kind of rulings, kind of scholars that you're looking at. So look, when you see contexts where people are forcing an opinion, and it's a harsh opinion, and it's making life difficult, and it's bizarre, right? Stand up to it. Stand up, find alternatives and say, look, you can't impose it. I'm not saying you're not entitled to this, but you can't impose it, okay? Because it's wrong. You can quote Sufyan al-Thawri if you want to, and say that this is not the way of our pious predecessors, you might say. Okay, I'm ending there. Inshallah, thank you for being on this journey. It's been a long session today. Alhamdulillah, we've come to the end of it. I just want to remind us all of the fact that, this is a time where we are given an opportunity by Allah to take stock. It's a time of challenge, that for some people, isolation itself is a great challenge, because some people are actually lonely. They're isolated in isolation. And please be conscious of that. Of course, at the same time, while we're living in isolation and life seems quite honky-dory, there are dementors at the gate, you might say, to use a Harry Potter analogy, wafting around this, this little particle, and it's destroyed lives. We have people, I think many of you will know people who are in ITU at the moment. So please, let's spare a dua for them. Let's spare dua also for all those people who have passed away, and for their families, and the immense suffering where people have just been wrenched from them. Sometimes you're saying goodbye to them at the door, and the next time you meet them is at the graveside. Subhanallah. May Allah protect us all, keep us safe and keep us strong in our iman, keep us overflowing in the love for Allah, for His Messenger, for His religion, for His book, for His people, and for the people of this land. Make us people of mercy, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, have mercy on all those who are in difficult times, who are suffering. Ya Allah, have mercy on those who've passed away. Ya Allah, bless those people who are fighting to save lives across the country. They are true mujahideen of whatever religion background they might be. Bless them, give them ease, preserve their lives, make it bearable for them to do the immense great work that they're doing. Ameen. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.